This is Dr. Ray Parker. I welcome you now to lecture number 1 for the course Communication for Growth, Analysis, and Application. I think as we begin this course, at least as we begin this first lecture, uh, it, there are certain things that are obvious when you think about communication. Uh, for example, I think effective communication is usually an assumption of most individuals when we talk, when we write. I think it's an assumption in regard to most organizations, probably even most Christian leaders. Communication rarely receives attention until a complication occurs due to some communication failure. And of course, it's this failure, this communication failure, that then often leads to an investigation in which we find ourselves asking such questions as, well, who knew about this? Who shared this with others? Well, how did this particular individual know about this? Or, well, who was supposed to know about this? And probably scores of other questions. In reality, I think it is a truism that Christian leaders are responsible for safeguarding the communicative system of their organizations. Now, this is especially important for, in reality, organizations are dependent on developing an effective communication culture if they're going to have success. Churches, ministry organizations, Christian schools, mission boards, Christian colleges, and so forth are certainly places where influence and ideas and innovation and initiatives, all of these things are developed and shared within the context of these Christian organizations. The style of communication that a particular ministry demonstrates reflects many things. I think it certainly reflects its values and its priorities in regard to ministry. I think of the words of the Bible translator J.B. Phillips. J.B. Phillips once said, quote, "If words are to enter men's hearts and bear fruit, they must be the right words, shaped cunningly to pass men's defenses and explode silently and effectively within their minds." End of quote. Now, I think this not only applies to what Phillips was dealing, that is Bible translation and Bible teaching and Bible preaching, but I think it also is certainly a truism in the simple day-to-day communications involved in our organizational structures, our organizational life. The goal of this study, therefore, is to deal broadly with the principles and problems of communication as they are found in almost all phases of Christian relationships. The communicative process, without doubt, is a dynamic process. It's always in operation. Whenever people are confronted with each other, the communicative process is certainly active. I think as we begin this important journey, this journey into a study of communication, perhaps a good place to start would be with communicative theory. Now, in recent years, Christian leaders have become increasingly aware of the significance of sound communication theory in developing a satisfactory witness for the gospel, either in terms of individual Christians or even the collective assembly where we come together for worship. An article in Christianity Today magazine expressed the significance of communicative theory for the church in this way, quote, "These theories and others like them hold new insight for all Christians who will study and apply them. Not only the intended meaning of the words used, but also the meanings which the hearer's experience gives to those words are essential to communication. Attention to communication theory can be the basis of greater effectiveness in witnessing the gospel of Christ." End of quote. These principles of communication theory literally operate whenever people are confronted with each other. These principles affect the relationship between a husband and wife, between parents and children, between co-workers, between ministry workers, and the list goes on. They are operative in every classroom situation in the Christian school or the Christian church. These dynamics come into play, for example, when a Sunday school superintendent consults a church member about the possibility of teaching a class, or when the church board meets to discuss plans for a new building. In fact, many of the problems that we face today in the evangelical church are the result of a breakdown in communication between people. If this breakdown is to be repaired, it is essential that church leaders understand the communicative process. And thus, we present ourselves, involve ourselves in this particular discussion. Perhaps the place to begin would be with some of the terms that are bounced about in communicative theory discussions today. I think it's accurate to say that effective communication is important in gaining and maintaining satisfactory human relationships, as well as successful work and ministry relationships. To communicate is to exchange a message with someone for the purpose of achieving common meaning. In other words, to be understood. Now, let me say that again. To communicate is to exchange a message with someone for the purpose of achieving common meanings. In other words, to be understood. I think it's often the case that in the work of Christian leaders, for example, there are two types of communication. There's verbal, including oral and written, and there's nonverbal. And of course, we're going to explore both of these in the moments ahead. Studies have found that leaders tend to prefer oral communication over written communication. These same studies have indicated that approximately 75% of work hours in communicating with others involve oral communication. Now, the communicative process has several basic components, which of course we will see in detail as we move forward in our lectures. These components include such terms as the sender, encoding, the message, the receiver, decoding, noise, and feedback. When communication provides for relatively immediate feedback, it is called two-way communication. Without feedback, it's known only as one-way communication. Christian leaders need to be concerned with the flow of all information among the various parts of the ministry organization. Formal communication in organizations follows channels specified many times by the official structure of the organization and the related tasks that are involved. Communication in organization flows in two basic directions. There's vertical communication and horizontal communication. In addition, the concepts of communication that are the methods of communication have literally multiplied in the last years. Electronic mail systems, voicemail, teleconferencing systems, and so forth are all examples of new communication aids that are able to assist Christian leaders in their work. Now, as we think about these introductory terms, perhaps a good place to begin would be with the first word of our course, communication. Communication is the transmission of information and meaning from one party to another through the use of shared symbols. Or, as Dr. Gangle has written, communication is the transmission of ideas between persons in a language that is common to both. The communicative process is a dynamic one. It's always in operation as people are confronted with one another. Another researcher defined communication as the exchange of messages between people for the purpose of achieving common meanings. And then another researcher described communication as the transfer of information that is meaningful to those who are involved. Now, in each of these definitions and descriptions, the concepts of meaning and understanding are emphasized. I think the point is clear. Unless meanings are shared, leaders find it extremely difficult to influence others. I read an interesting article recently by former General Motors CEO Roger Smith. In the article, Smith wrote this. Listen to his words. Quote, "I wish I'd done a better job of communicating with GM people. I'd do that differently a second time around, and I'd make sure they understood and shared my vision for the company. Then they would have known why I was tearing up the place, taking out whole divisions, changing whole production schedules. If people understood the why, then they'll work at it. Like I said, I never got all this across. There we were, charging up the right hill, right on schedule, and yet I looked behind me and saw that many people were still at the bottom of the hill. They were trying to decide whether to come along. It seemed like a lot of them had gotten off the train." End of quote. I think, as Smith's predicament illustrates, communication is a critical part of every leader's job. Without effective communication, even the most brilliant strategies and the best laid plans may not be successful. Communication. And then let's notice the second word of this course. Communication 4. You see, the communicative process is designed for or intended to accomplish specific objectives. Communication certainly happens in many forms, but always for the same purpose: to make something understandable. Thus, Christian leaders must be effective communicators. We put these facts together and we certainly discover that communication is more than just talking. It's more than just speaking. It's more than just reading. True communication takes place when an understanding has been transferred from one party or one source to another. Now, hear that statement again. True communication takes place when an understanding has been transferred from one party or one source to another. There are times when Christian leaders spend tremendous amount of energy developing very good ideas and important programs only to eventually do a poor job of communicating them. And of course, the end result is often great programs that go largely unused. A Christian leader's first step in becoming an effective communicator is to develop an appreciation for the importance of communication. You see, the problem is not that Christian leaders tend to belittle the importance of communication, but the problem is often they failed to think consciously, deeply about it. In reality, Christian leaders spend most of their time communicating in one form or another. If Christian leaders and those with whom they interact do not communicate effectively, well, the repercussions can certainly be serious. And in many ways, it's not going to only impact the individuals, but oftentimes it impacts the ministry organization as well. Therefore, miscommunications can slow down and even short circuit what would be an effective program throughout the organization. On the other hand, concentrated efforts to promote effective communication can certainly be a key ingredient in an organization's success. Communication for growth. The object of all Christian ministry is growth. If we deal with the unsaved, we desire that they grow in understanding and apply the gospel. If we deal with the saved, we desire that they grow in the grace and the knowledge of Jesus Christ. Thus, Christian leaders must be effective communicators. Donald Eli of Syracuse University wrote, quote, "There is nothing quite so wonderful as a good idea. There is nothing so tragic as a good idea which cannot be communicated." See, the point is the heart of communication is the message to be shared. The centrality of the message is certainly significant to evangelicals. The ultimate source of the Christian message is certainly not the mind of the communicator, but rather the mind of God himself. For God has revealed himself through his word, the Bible. The Christian leader studies the Bible, illuminated by the Holy Spirit. The leader then must go to communicate those revealed and illuminated ideas to others. Now, it should be obvious even to the casual observer that an idea that exists only in the mind of the communicator is of no value to anyone else. The Christian who knows the gospel but does not share the gospel cannot fulfill biblical commands to witness, and therefore does not assist unsaved friends to know God. The message, therefore, must be verbalized, or symbolized in some way so that it can be communicated in an understandable fashion to others. Our nature and our situations literally demand that we communicate. We're often involved in the process almost as a automatic response, even without thinking about it. Of course, that may be why the process of communication can fall into error and carelessness. Many of the problems that we face today in the evangelical community result from a breakdown in communication between people. And if we are to repair this breakdown, then that means Christian leaders must understand the communication process. A few additional thoughts. Communication is the process we go through to convey understanding from one person or group to another. Unless understanding occurs, we have not communicated. I think it's certainly obvious if anyone who studies the Gospels that Jesus knew the importance of communication, and he worked hard, he worked with diligence to make sure that understanding occurred between himself and his listeners. I think of the question that Jesus asked in Matthew 13, verse 51, as he looked at his disciples in this great teaching scenario, great teaching situation. And he said, have you understood these things? The foundation of all communication, if it's successful, is that reality of understanding. I think as we read through the gospel records, we quickly conclude that Jesus was a dynamic, remarkable, effective communicator. He was never boring, but he was always stimulating. He was never pompous or distant, but he was always personal and lovingly concerned. It's no wonder that people who heard him often addressed him as teacher. I believe that the gospel stand as a ready source of ideas and examples on how to communicate effectively. Studying how Jesus communicated can prompt us to improve our own communicative skill and thus enhance our effectiveness in communicating the Bible to others. The communicative methods used by Jesus are as effective today as when he used them. The problems that he confronted, well, they're similar to those that are confronted by men literally in all ages. The truths that he taught are truths that are being communicated today, and they have application today, even as they did when the words exited the lips of Christ. The communicative principles that Jesus followed are literally universally applicable. Dedicated Christian communicators who have followed the style of Jesus in his teaching have seen the Holy Spirit work through them to foster spiritual growth in others. What a communicator. Even secular educators acclaim Jesus as an outstanding communicator. Almost 100 years ago, E.L. Kemp wrote, quote, measured by the nature of the lessons he taught, by his method of presenting them, by the number of persons whom they reached, and by the results that they have accomplished, he was the greatest teacher of all teachers, end of quote. How wise to follow the master as we seek to understand the communication process. For communication for the Christian leader is of vital importance. I think this statement should lead us to a question which in many ways is obvious and yet perhaps needs to be explored. Why is communication important to Christian leaders? Well, I think volumes could be written in response to this powerful question. I mean, it's safe to say that Christian leaders spend most of their time in one way or another in this communicative process. I mean, leadership, and we know this by experience, leadership does not take place in a vacuum. Leadership, if it is leadership, in one way or another has, and here's a key word, influence on others. Some have said that probably the simplest definition of leadership is just this word, influence. If you influence A to do something that A would not otherwise have done, then you have exercised leadership. And would it not be true that that leadership with that kind of success demands communication? I mean, we do not have influence pills, just give a pill or two to each person in your organization and poof, immediately they're influenced to do what they should be doing. No, in reality, influence involves not some magical process, but influence involves communication. Therefore, communication is of vital importance to the Christian leader. One researcher stated that communication is important to the Christian leader because communication is the process by which Christian leaders accomplish the decision-making responsibilities of, and he listed 4 things: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. You see, in one way or another, every Christian leader is involved in these 4 administrative challenges. A leader must be a planner. Planning involves setting goals, deciding how best to achieve these goals. This process in itself involves considering what must be done to encourage necessary levels of change and innovation. And then in addition, a Christian leader has to be an organizer. Organizing focuses on allocating and arranging human and non-human resources so that plans can be carried out successfully. The leader must determine what tasks are to be done, how these tasks can best be combined into specific jobs, and how these jobs can be grouped into various units that make up the structure of the ministry or the structure of the organization. So a Christian leader is a planner, a Christian leader is an organizer, a Christian leader is a leader. Leadership involves influencing others to engage in the various tasks that are necessary to reach the established goals. Leading demands communication, vision, direction, motivation, and inspiration. And then finally, a Christian leader is going to be involved as a controller. This leadership role is aimed at regulating organizational activities so that actual performance conforms to the expected standards and the goals of the organization. The leader must monitor ongoing activities, compare the results with the expected standards, and then he or she has to take corrective action as needed. And all of this involves what? All of this involves communication. Therefore, I think we can say this. Communication involves people. It is important, therefore, to understand how people interpret. Communication involves shared meaning. In order for people to communicate, they must agree on the meaning of the terms that are used. And communication is symbolic. Communication involves gestures, sounds, letters, numbers, words, and so forth. We're reminded once again that communication is more than talking. Communication is more than speaking. Communication is more than reading. True communication takes place when an understanding has been transferred from one party or one source to another. Communication, therefore, is the transfer of information that is meaningful to those involved in the process. That is meaningful to those involved in the process. I think this leads us to an important question. What elements are involved in a successful communication model? In the next few moments, we will closely examine something of the nature of communication and several important factors that can impede communication or enhance the way individuals communicate based upon the elementary components of the communicative process. So what elements are involved in a successful communication model? First, we have the sender. Now, the sender is the initiator of the process, the initiator of the message. Messages are usually initiated in response to some outside stimulus, a question, perhaps, or a meeting or an interview, a problem, a formal presentation, or a requested report. The stimulus triggers a need or a desire for the sender to communicate or attempt to achieve a common meaning with an individual or group. Thus, the source of an idea in person-to-person communication is the mind of the communicator. This is where the idea or the thought originates and receives its motivation to be transmitted in the thought process to another person. So the first element in a successful communication model is the sender or the source, the person with the message or information and a purpose for communicating that material to other individuals. Now, the sender is going to involve himself in what educational theorists often refer to as encoding. Basically, encoding is the process of translating the intended message into words or gestures. In other words, when a message has been decided, it must be verbalized or symbolized in some way so that it can be communicated to other people. Encoding is not all verbal, though in most forms of human communication, it certainly would consist largely of verbalization. But it must be remembered that good communication will also involve a visual element. A basic problem in communication is that people do not always say what they mean, nor mean what they say. Sometimes it is even thought impossible by some to verbally encode their ideas. A common statement which demonstrates this difficulty in the encoding sometimes would sound like this: well, I know what I want to say, but I just can't explain it to you. As long as one persists in that attitude, he's nipping the communicating process in the bud. It's not going to happen. Nothing can be achieved in the transmission of information unless it is first encoded. The man, for example, who is too in love for words had better find some words fast, lest his fair love wander off to another young man who may not have as much love, but knows how to express that love to the young lady. So the sender must involve himself in the encoding process. The sender is going to translate the information to be shared into a series of symbols, that's words or gestures. And the sender believes that these words and gestures are going to have the same meaning to the receiver. Now, there are many challenges in doing this. One is the fact that research has shown that for the 500 most commonly used English words, there are over 14,000 definitions. So the sender is challenged in the encoding process to find words of commonality, words that are going to mean the same not only to you, but are going to be mean the same in the mind of the one receiving the message. Now, having encoded the message, the communicator must then craft what is referred as the transmission process. The transmission process is the outcome of the encoding process, and it consists of the verbal and nonverbal symbols that have been developed to convey the meaning to the receiver. In other words, this is the method used to convey the message to the intended receiver. Examples include written words in a memo, spoken words over the phone, graphics on a slide, gestures in face-to-face situations, and so forth. The sender of a message must consider the appropriateness of the medium. For example, a phone call may be an effective means of resolving a conflict over a minor issue, but a face-to-face meeting may be more appropriate for negotiating a major change within the organization. So the sender now has to determine how he's going to transmit this message in the not only the verbal, but also the vocal and the visual elements which are involved in this sharing process. Now, all of this is taking place and is directed toward the receiver. So the sender, from which the message originates, is directing this communicative process toward one who is to receive the message. The receiver is the person with whom the message is exchanged. Now, if no exchange takes place, that is, if the receiver does not receive the message, well, there's no communication. There may be one receiver of the message, and as in a conversation between two individuals, or many receivers of the message, as in the case of a report which is sent to various members of an organization, which could be 10, 15, 20, or perhaps 100 or more. But the receiver is the person whose senses are now challenged to perceive the sender's message. And again, the challenge is what I say, I must express in such a way that it means what I mean in the mind of the receiver. The receiver, therefore, is involved in what is referred by communicative theorists as decoding. When the message is received, the receiver engages in this process. This is a process of translating. It's translating the symbols that have been received from the sender into an interpreted message. When the communication is effective, the sender and the receiver achieve a common meaning. However, the decoding process may result in misunderstanding. This happens if the receiver does not decode the message that the sender intended. Now, two things are significant here. First, if the originator of the message wishes the receiver to decode properly, he must take pains to encode his message clearly in a form that will be understandable to the receiver. Furthermore, he must be somewhat confident that the receiver has the wherewithal to carry on the decoding process. For example, how foolish it would be to speak to one in Russian if you know in advance that the only language that this individual understands is English. I mean, in such a situation, decoding could not take place no matter how elegant the message. So the receiver, and it involves in the process of decoding, the receiver interprets the message and translates it into meaningful information. Now, one of the problems, we'll see more of this later, involved in this whole communicative process is what theorists refer to as noise. Basically, noise is any factor in the communication process that interferes with exchanging messages and achieving common meaning. Noise includes, for example, interruptions while the sender is encoding static on the phone line as a message is being transmitted, or even fatigue on the part of the receiver while he or she is in the decoding process. I remember some time ago I was teaching a seminar in a hotel conference room in Charlotte, North Carolina. I probably began, I think it was about 11 o'clock, about an hour before our lunch break, when a meeting of vending company Salesforce personnel began next door to our seminar room. Now, they were, of course, involved in all of those motivational activities that salespeople are involved. There were singing, there were loud games, there were gimmicks, skits, and so forth. Now, needless to say, this was noise. This was a distraction to what we were trying to accomplish within the seminar. Noise, of course, could be so many things. Noise could be the sound of an air conditioner fan that needs to be oiled, the beeping of a wall thermostat or a smoke alarm that needs a battery, the loud ticking of a clock, anything that would distract the receiver from encoding the message or decoding the message correctly. If the source of the noise can be eliminated, well and good. If not, then the communicator must certainly use some creative methods to overcome the situation. In the Charlotte situation that I mentioned a moment ago, I found I had to resort to a similar type of presentation as was going on next door. I began to use listening teams and role-playing scenarios so that we were involved in doing things, and it helped us to concentrate on that which was important in the seminar, and to get our minds off of the noise that was coming from next door. So if you can eliminate it, that's good. If not, then you have to use some creative methods and means by which to try to counteract that noise. Another important element of a successful communication model is referred to as feedback. Now, feedback is an active process in any successful communication attempt. The lecturer can receive feedback as he lectures. Every time a person smiles or nods or yawns or looks at his watch or perhaps even gets up and walks out, the lecturer receives feedback. Even this non-verbal feedback tells us what is happening to some extent in the communicative process. Thus, feedback helps the communicator interpret whether or not the receiver has understood and internalized the message. In short, we need to find out whether or not we're getting through. When a mother says, "Johnny, didn't you hear me?" What's she asking for? She's asking for some kind of feedback. And when a classroom teacher asks for questions on the lesson, then that teacher is doing the same. That teacher is asking or seeking to solicit feedback. The team leader in a ministry situation who suggests an innovative idea and then keeps ears open for the next 2 weeks to gather comments, either negative or positive, is being sensitive to feedback, and certainly will be rewarded for efforts at improving and hopefully refining his idea. Someone said, how much feedback you want directly relates to your philosophy of leadership. The autocratic leader speaks and expects everyone to listen and to do what he asks without question. The democratic leader, on the other hand, is sensitive to what people think and is concerned whether or not his purposes and his actions are properly being understood by the group. So anytime you are communicating or seeking to communicate, you're involved in this process. Watch for feedback. Seek feedback. Ask for feedback. Notice items that give you an idea of what is going on in the mind of the receiver. Now, once you have received that feedback, then you're going to, again, approach your communication, but you're going to clarify. Once the communicator has received feedback from the receivers, and he notes gaps in the communicative process, then the communicator has opportunity to press the meaning of the message further. He can use illustrations. He can show models. He can speak from life experience. He can diagram the process, show pictures, and so forth. This allows the communicator to literally answer questions that are being asked, even if nonverbal, rather than seeking to answer questions that are not being asked. That would be, of course, a waste of time. Even in the best situation, you do not want to waste our students' time. Now, I think we might, moving forward in the process, I think we might be able in this discussion to summarize what we have said thus far, to summarize and to diagram and to demonstrate what we have said thus far. The communicative process can be illustrated in this way. The sender organizes some message or information that needs to be shared. The sender encodes this message or places it into a series of symbols, both verbal and visual. The sender then sends the message to the receiver by means of spoken words, tone, written words, gestures, and so forth. The receiver perceives the message via the decoding process. This is what the receiver heard the sender say. The receiver provides the sender with feedback. Based upon the feedback, the sender provides clarification. Well, now this is what I said. And all of this takes place in the midst of what is often identified as noise. Any factor that interferes with the communicative process. So, in one way or another, to be successful in our communication, then we are going to have to deal with this reality of noise. Well, this brings us to the end of lecture number 1.